So our next speaker is a proper scholar. He's Dr. Chris Wright, formerly the International Director of the Langham Partnerships. Many of us are very grateful to the work of Dr. John Stott, and the Langham Partnership was something that he founded to encourage biblical literacy, biblical preaching, and Dr. Chris Wright was the International Director. He is now the President.
No, Global Ambassador.
Oh, I'm sorry, Global Ambassador. That's even more grand.
Yeah.
And I've asked Chris to help us think about an Old Testament theology of migration. So could we give Dr. Chris a welcome?
Thank you. Thanks, Trish. Hi, great to be here this afternoon. And lovely to learn that Chris was born 26 years after the end of the Second World War. I was born just 2 years after the end of the Second World War, and I don't think I look any older than him, so that's not a bad thing. It's great to be here also with some of my colleagues from Langham Literature. Chris mentioned the Langham Partnership. If you want to know more about what that is and what we do ask me or my colleagues at the bookstall there. That's one of the three programs, literature. But just to say that Langham, founded by John Stott, works in many of the countries where this problem of migration, internal displacement and so on. We have some fantastic Langham scholars in Ukraine, for example, in Israel, Palestine, those areas, and many parts of Africa. So do find out a bit about what we are and also some of those books that are there. So let me get on the screen. Yeah, that's me, but I don't really need that one. Can we move to the next one? Thank you. There we go. So migration and refugees is our topic. And I think just very quickly, because I don't have a lot of time, but the first thing I just want to say is there are some useful resources. I hope you can read what's up there. There was a book produced some time back by Jonathan Burnside within the Jubilee Network, The Status and Welfare of Immigrants. Still worth a good read. It's very thorough and solid, published by the Jubilee Centre, and you'd have to go to their website now, I think, to get it. An older book by an Old Testament scholar, Christiana van Houten, The Alien in Israelite Law, is a very thorough look at all the aspects of foreigner, alien, immigrant in the Old Testament. And then also a couple of books by more majority world authors like Barnabe and Zuri Msaba, who is from Central Eastern Africa, Burundi, I think, The Wayfarer, and there's a copy of that on the bookstall, as well as one or two others that are on the issue of migration, so do go and have a look at them there. And then two others that I wanted to mention, one by two brothers, Mark and Luke Glanville. He's a biblical scholar, the other's a politician. They've written this one, Refuge Reimagined, Biblical Kinship in Global Politics. Has a great benefit of being both biblical and political. In other words, it does the math in terms of the issues politically and socially as well as theologically. And also by David Baker, Tight Fists and Open Hands. It's the wealth and poverty in Old Testament law, but one of the issues, one of the chapters is all about the vulnerable position of people who were in a situation of ethnic or other forms of marginalization within Old Testament Israel. So those are some of the background and the resources. Now, moving on, I think we all know, I'm sure we all know, that Jesus said that the first and second greatest commandments in the law are love the Lord your God, from the book of Deuteronomy, and love your neighbor as yourself, from the book of Leviticus. Sure, we all know that. What we perhaps don't know and should be more aware of is that those two same books, Deuteronomy and Leviticus, add, and you shall love the foreigner. As yourself, indeed, adds as Leviticus. In the same chapter as love your neighbor as yourself comes the verse, and you shall love the foreigner as yourself. And as we shall see in a moment, as we take a look at some of those texts, that message, which comes twice, love God comes once, love your neighbor comes once, love the foreigner actually comes twice in that precise form, that is supported by multiple laws and background within the Old Testament. But I just wanted, first of all, to underline what Bishop Gulley said, that this whole theme of migration is a biblical thread. It runs through the Bible like a narrative, as she mentioned from the very beginning, from Adam. I would certainly put it at least back there with Abraham, that you might say Yahweh, the God of Israel, has been on the move all through human history and has dragged people with him all through human history in various kinds of migrations. So very quickly, what's on the screen, Abraham says to the Hittites in the land, Genesis 23, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. but would you please let me buy a plot of land to bury my wife? Moses in Exodus 2 names his son, his first son, Gershom, and he explains it by saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. He just emigrated under pressure from Egypt to Midian, and it's not sure which country he thinks he's a foreigner in, because he was really at home in neither. Deuteronomy begins in chapter 2 with God saying that it wasn't just bringing the Israelites into their land. He'd been moving the Moabites around, the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Zamzamites, whoever they were. Chapter 2, our NIVs put those little verses in parentheses as if they're sort of, not really important. Actually, what it is saying is God's been moving people around the chessboard of history long before he even moved Israel. And so the Israelites are told in chapter 23, verse 7, don't despise an Egyptian because you resided as foreigners in their country. The Israelites remembered that they had been famine asylum seekers in Egypt way back in their history, and for that reason were to treat the Egyptians slightly different from other nations. In chapter 26, verse 5, the Israelite farmer, every harvest was to go to the sanctuary and to say these words, my father was a wandering Aramean, probably referring to Jacob. The Lord says, the land is mine, in Leviticus 25, verse 23, and you Israelites, you are like resident aliens with me. You are immigrants in my land. It's my land, and you've come here, says God in Leviticus. And then, of course, there's the story of foreigners like Ruth, a Moabite, an immigrant to Bethlehem. Amos chapter 9, God says that, aren't you Israelites to me, like the Syrians and the Cushites? I brought them up from here and from there. And of course, in the New Testament, Jesus himself experiences being a refugee, perhaps about the age of maybe 2, given that was the age that Herod decided to slaughter the other little children in Bethlehem. So that would have had a traumatic effect on him. We know trauma affects young children who are in that kind of displacement, dragged out of his little town of Bethlehem to Egypt. And then, of course, we have the dispersions in the book of Acts. And 1 Peter says, all you Christians are the saints scattered abroad, living as pilgrims and exiles. So what I'm trying to just get across with this very brief survey is that the mixing and the migrations of nations, as Krish has just said, is not a new thing. It's part of human history, and it's certainly part of biblical history, and it lies within the sovereignty of God. Let's move on to a couple of definitions so that we know what we're talking about. Here are the two main words that are used in the Old Testament for basically what we're talking about. The first is the word ger, or gerim in the plural, which means it's often translated in our Bibles as foreigner, sometimes alien, sometimes even as immigrant, and I think actually that's probably closest to what it meant, because these were residents in Israel who did not have a share in either the kinship network, they were not ethnic descendants of the tribes of Israel, and therefore they did not have a share in the land of Israel. They hadn't got their allotment within the tribal clan proportions. So they were very dependent on living by, in a sense, the grace and favor of Israelite households, which was fine if they'd been welcomed and they'd got a job and they were working, but they were, of course, vulnerable. They weren't slaves, they were free. They weren't just visiting foreigners, they were resident, but they had come in somehow into the country. Some of them might have been the remains of the old Canaanite populations that hadn't been wiped out. Others of them might have come because of war or other reasons. Jonathan Burnside in his book says this, that it is sensible to suggest this noun should be translated as immigrant because people usually became gerim as a result of social and political upheavals, which could be caused by war, famine, oppression, plague, and other social misfortunes. So that's the gerim, and they're there all through the Old Testament, regularly spoken about in the law and indeed in the prophets. The other word, nokri, or nokriim, and zarim, they were more truly foreigners. That is, they weren't really resident. They just had come and they go. They were visitors. Maybe they were traveling merchants or diplomats or soldiers. These were the sort of the real strangers, those who weren't at all part of the community. They get a bit of a bad press in Proverbs, for example, and elsewhere. And they were exempted, or they weren't included in some of Israel's laws, like, for example, prohibiting taking interest. You could take an interest from a foreigner. And yet at the same time, it's interesting, as it's on the screen, that in a number of places, Israel was told to treat them with kindness, respect. For example, 1 Kings 8 is where Solomon prays to God and says, God, when the foreigner, one of the Nokri, come to the temple and prays here, do whatever he asks, so that people to the ends of the earth will know your name. So answer their prayers. Isaiah 56 speaks about foreigners who would come and be welcomed in the temple, along with eunuchs. And Isaiah 60 sees foreigners bringing their wealth into the city of God, as it were, which is picked up in the book of Revelation. So those are just definitions, Gerim and Nokrim, but the most common one is the Gerim. So what then were the laws about these people? Now here I just want us to take us as quickly as I can through basically 8 areas in which Old Testament law specifically speaks about these. Now what have I got on the screen? Oh, they're all 4 are there, that's good, of the first half. First of all, there's passages which give Gerim foreigners protection from general abuse or oppression. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you are foreigners in Egypt. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. Exodus and Leviticus. Secondly, there's specific protection in the legal system for justice in the courts. Do not oppress a foreigner, because you yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you are foreigners in Egypt. That in chapter 23 of Exodus is specifically in the area of court procedures. The responsibility of judges and witnesses and participants in a court case. Or what Moses says to the judges, I charged your judges at that time, hear the disputes between your people and judge fairly, whether the case is between 2 Israelites or between an Israelite and a foreigner residing among you. That's the word ger again. Do not show partiality in judging. Here, great and small. So specifically in the courts, there was to be equality. Do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 17 and 18. Indeed, cursed is anyone who denies justice to a foreigner, says Deuteronomy 27. They were to be included in Sabbath rest. Interestingly, that on Sabbath, it wasn't just that the Israelites could rest and all the foreigners could do the work. No, Deuteronomy 25 specifically says, you're not to do any blah, 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 nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that the whole community can rest. And along with that, fourthly, Gerim were included within the worship and covenant community, a kind of religious assimilation into all the benefits of belonging to that religious community, provided they were circumcised. So, for example, they could partake of the Passover if they were circumcised. They benefited from the triennial tithe, that 10% of GDP that was set aside every 3rd year as a kind of social destitution fund, and that was available for resident aliens, foreigners, as well as widows and orphans. They're included in the annual feasts in Deuteronomy 16. Did you know that holidays are biblical? In the Old Testament you had 3 weeks holiday a year, and you were commanded to rejoice and feast and have a good time. Those are the great festivals, and the foreigners were included. They were to be included in the Day of Atonement and present when the law was being read out in the great ceremonies in Deuteronomy 29 and 31. And then what about employment? I need to move on to the next slide, I think, if I can. There we go. Well, in employment, they were to be treated fairly. Now, it's interesting that one of the very first law that God gave to the Israelites after the 10 Commandments in the book of Exodus refers to Hebrew slaves. Now, the word Hebrew, probably in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, isn't referring simply to ethnic Israelites, the people who spoke the language of Hebrew. It probably was more of a social appellation to do something like a rootless class of people who were vulnerable, as the Israelites were when they were in Egypt, which is where they're most commonly called Hebrews. In other words, people like migrant workers and others. And so there's a kind of situation where if someone in that position offers their services to an Israelite household, they were to have a kind of 6-year contract, after which they were to be free to leave or to stay if they chose to, one way or the other. So Exodus 21 and 15 gives a kind of protection to people in that situation in their work. And indeed, Deuteronomy 15 says that if at the end of those 6 years you decide the Hebrew slave decides to leave you and go out into freedom, then give him a good redundancy package. Really garland him. That's literally garland him with a really good stock of flocks and wine and oil and grain and so on, so he can make a fresh start. And also the prompt payment of wages. is there repeatedly in Old Testament law, in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. And here it is in its Deuteronomy form. Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing among you. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. Not just that you've sort of neglected a fair day's wage, you've actually sinned against God. And will incur his judgment if you're not paying your workers properly. What would that do to British law, I wonder, especially those who are in professions where they're there as migrants and foreigners on sometimes less than minimum wages. And then alongside that, is the right of gleaning. The foreigners, of course, did not own land. They weren't shared in the distribution of land. But the law specifically says that although they haven't got land, they should be able to, quote, eat and be satisfied, which, of course, is a great privilege of the Israelites themselves. It's language that's there often in Deuteronomy. So when you're harvesting your field and you overlook a sheaf, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner and the fatherless and the widow, the three categories that are so often referred to together, so that the Lord your God may bless you in the work of your hands. And then similarly with the olives and the grapes and so on, leave them for the foreigner. So the right of gleaning is there. And of course the book of Ruth is such a wonderful illustration of that, and the way in which Boaz, in his righteousness and his faithfulness, offers protection to Ruth from his own workers, because there's that suspicion that she might have been treated rather badly as a foreigner, especially as a Moabite and a woman, when she was there gleaning in the field along with other Israelites. There she was, taking our food, et cetera, et cetera. All those kind of feelings might have been there, and Boaz offers protection from that. And seventhly, and very interestingly, there's the right of asylum and non-return, non-refoulement, as we would call it today. The Israelite slave law is astonishing because it's the diametric opposite of pretty well every slave law that's existed in history, where a runaway slave is subject to all sorts of penalties, including death, and harboring a runaway slave was also a civic penalty. But the Israelite law says if a slave has taken refuge with you, literally runs away and comes to you, do not hand them over to their master. Don't send him back. Let them live among you wherever they like and in whatever time they choose, which interestingly is precisely the same form of words as the temple where Yahweh would put his name, that you must worship God in whatever place the Lord chooses. And here the slave is given that theologically rich sense. Let him live wherever he chooses. Don't just stick them in some, town on the edge of the land where they can't even make a living at all. Do not oppress them. Now, the slaves, of course, weren't strictly immigrants necessarily, but the fact that a slave could seek refuge, presumably from cruel treatment or some kind of situation where they needed to get away from, that a slave of that sort was provided with refuge and asylum surely speaks to a principle that people in that similar situation should have the same rights. And it's there built into Old Testament law, whatever it is, more than 1,000 years before Christ. We haven't even caught up yet with the laws of Mount Sinai, let alone the laws of our land. And then finally, number 8, the interesting principle of equality before the law for foreigners with the native born. And again, this comes in the same chapter as love your neighbor as yourself. It's there at the end, towards the end of Leviticus chapter 19, that those who were foreigners in the land were to be treated with equality when there was any legal dispute, either between them or between them and an Israelite. And indeed, the same love commandment as love your neighbor as yourself is followed in Leviticus 19:34. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. From the laws of Moses, and we ain't there yet. Love them as yourself. Literally, love him, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were foreigners in Egypt, and I am the Lord your God. And that, as I say, is paired up with Deuteronomy chapter 10, where you get the Lord your God is God of gods, Lord of lords, great God mighty. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow. He loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And again, the same form of words, precisely the only 4 occasions in Hebrew where this occurs. And therefore you shall love the foreigner, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. So that's a quick survey of the law. Moving rapidly on in just a couple of minutes, what motivated all of this? And I would want to suggest that there are three major motivations in Old Testament for why they should behave like this, of which the first is, this is what Yahweh is like. This is the character and, that's the second one. This is what God has done for you. In other words, regularly it says, don't oppress a foreigner. Why not? Well, you were foreigners in Egypt. You know what it's like to have been a foreigner. And so the historical experience of Israel in the past should have governed the way they treated those who came to their land from outside. And that's one reason why I find, Chris was saying a bit about this, that it's embarrassingly ironic to me that so many Western societies, like our own in the UK, which are basically built on historic migrations and immigrations. Some nations like Australia and USA wouldn't be there as the countries they are today without the immigration. It's these very countries that have experienced centuries of immigration, one way or another, which are those which are so now opposed to anybody else, as it were, coming, including sometimes second-generation immigrants themselves in our political system. It's ironic that it's often those who have benefited from the sort of welcome that Bishop Gully was talking about, I don't know how many years ago after the Iranian Revolution, and it's those who are now most violently opposed to people who had been in the same situation. And there's also this ironic hypocrisy that somehow the language is always, I mean, Chris talked about how we talk about illegal asylum seekers, which is nonsense, they can't be. But why is it that everybody who comes to our country, they're a migrant? And they're economic migrants, which is a bad thing. Whereas when British people economically migrate to elsewhere, and they're expats. They're expats, not migrants. It's why do we have such, discrimination? So that's the first one. The second, of course, is the character and actions of Yahweh himself. I think I've got them wrong from where it was on the screen. The character and actions of Yahweh. This is what God is like. That's explicit in Deuteronomy 10. The Lord your God loves the foreigners, and therefore you must do the same. And isn't that precisely the way Jesus frames it in the Sermon on the Mount? He says, I think developing that Leviticus passage, love your enemies, he says. You've heard love your neighbor and hate your enemy. What I say, love your enemies. Why on earth should I love my enemy? Well, because God does. God loves those who, whether they love him or hate him, whether they're friends or enemies, God makes his sun and his rain to come upon them. And then thirdly, there's the sharing of covenant obedience, the blessing of covenant obedience. Deuteronomy 26 is a marvelous chapter. You'll find that that's what the Israelite farmer says. I'm bringing this to God because God has blessed me. He's given me this land. It's a wonderful blessing in the first part of the chapter. Then he says, and I've kept God's law. I've separated out the sacred portion which belongs to God, and I've given it to the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. And then you're able to say, now God, will you please continue to bless us and our family and your family together. So the sharing of the abundance of the land with the foreigner is a way in which the sharing of covenant blessing is shared around. And, of course, avoiding God's curse in Deuteronomy 27. Now, I don't have time to go on to the last slide, but you may want to jot those references down, because all of this that's in the law is exemplified and hammered home in the prophets. So Isaiah, interestingly, called Judah to actually hide the fugitives of Moab, even though they're enemies. Don't betray the refugees. Let the Moabite fugitives stay with you and shelter them. That's in Isaiah. Jeremiah condemns twice those who were oppressing the fatherless. He even says that the government would be illegitimate if they continued to oppress foreigners. Says that to the kings coming in to Jerusalem. Do no wrong and violence to the foreigners, and I will let you live here. And you can go on reigning here. Ezekiel has the same kind of values of the princes of Israel, what they were doing as a government and what the general people were doing. And Malachi, at the very end of the Old Testament, still brings it back, where God says, I will be quick to testify against sorcerers, adulterers, perjurers, those who defraud laborers of their wages, those who oppress widows and fatherless, and those who deprive foreigners of justice, and don't fear me. I just can't get away from the fact that this sheer quantity of biblical material is there. It outweighs by tons what the Old Testament has to say about sexual ethics. And I don't want to be misunderstood. Of course, the Bible gives us a very clear, godly sexual ethic and very specific laws about the breaking of those sexual ethics. But the sheer weight of what God says about this outweighs that a lot. It's obviously a major concern of biblical faith. God really cares about this and about the treatment of outsiders, migrants, refugees, and immigrants among all the other marginalized people that the Bible talks about. So that's something of an Old Testament perspective on the issue we're facing today. Thank you, Krish.